Hey, y'all, week five, big summary and messiest issues video. Failed so spectacularly last week at keeping this thing. I think last week I said like 8 minutes. I'm going to say under 10 minutes this week, but I'm absolutely going to make it. So, having said that, I'm going to jump right in. So, we had two readings this week. Of course, we're going to get further in depth with them on Thursday evening, but I did want to just throw this out there for you all, as I said, just to help work through some issues and give you an idea of what I think are some the summary of the chapter. Okay, so first things first, chapter 4, pragmatism in education. Here's the big summary. Okay, so pragmatism is based on three things, the three fundamental ideas. Induction, human experience as being central, and the relationship between science and culture. Those are the three fundamental building blocks which have informed the development of pragmatism. It's important to understand that because pragmatism has a lot of varied sources in terms of the influences that have created it as a school of thought or a philosophy. So it's important to understand that those are really three fundamental building blocks: induction, human experience, and the relationship between science and culture. Second, pragmatism is a philosophy that encourages us to look for the processes or the ends that will lead to desirable results. Okay, so this is a lot about, we're probably on Thursday, we're going to talk a lot about means and ends, but it boils down to being dedicated to achieving a certain result or the end and being agnostic about what it takes to get there, the means. I'm going to talk a little bit about that idea of being agnostic about the means on Thursday and actually later in this slideshow too. But you also, as a pragmatist, would still realize that the means matter to the end. So that's one of the messiest issues I'll bring up here in a second. Third, pragmatism is basically an American thought, but it has its roots deep in European thinkers. Fourth, ideas are tools like hammers and microchips that are devised to cope with the world, and they are created by social groups. So ideas are presented by pragmatists a little differently than some other philosophical viewpoints that we've looked at. Pragmatism is sometimes painted as secular humanism. The book presents that as the chapter, presents that as a often levied criticism against pragmatism. Pragmatists believe that education is a necessity so people can face the problems they encounter in their environments. So social groups and environments are heavily influencing this philosophy. And finally, education should have an aim, another way to think of ends or results. Okay, so there's the big summary. Again, we'll go over that on Thursday, and you all will try to add some flavor of your own summaries to this as well. So also in chapter 4, I wanted to touch on 5 kind of messy issues or things that I thought might be just a little bit less easy to grasp than some of the other things. So first of all, do we care about means or not? So pragmatism, the way it's presented in the chapter and somewhat in the article, it is very dedicated to the ends, but it does not, and as I say, can be agnostic about the means, meaning whatever the best tool is to achieve our end, those are the most important tools. Those could be different today than they are next week, next year, or in the following decades. But they are still important. So we care about means. It's not the focus as a pragmatist on the end does not mean that you don't care about the means. It's just that you are somewhat uncaring about which means you're tied to. So if a particular mean is going to achieve your result, then you're going to use that. You are also aware, so means and ends are important. It's an important relationship for a pragmatist, because as a pragmatist, you're also aware that whatever mean is employed has an outcome on the end, right? So whatever instructional tool I choose to use to get the most out of you all in terms of development and growth in this class, that's going to influence the eventual growth and development. So I care most about the growth and development, and I choose what tool I'm going to use because I think that will promote that. However, the tool itself also has an impact. So the mean really does matter to the end. Okay. Secondly, but the end is most important. That's the thing I want you to take away for a pragmatist. Secondly, how important are experiences to pragmatists? Extremely important. So throughout the chapter, especially the chapter 4, you'll see in many of the fundamental thinkers that have influenced this philosophy present, especially Dewey, present social groups or the environment or both as really, really influential. So the environment, especially, and experiences and environment, we'll use interchangeably to some degree on Thursday when we discuss this. But experiences in the environment are hugely influential because as those change, as experiences are gained and the environment changes, pragmatists believe that that should then influence your view on on education and on the tools which should be used to educate, whether it be young folks or whomever. Those things should influence your means, which we'll talk about on Thursday is a criticism which is levied at pragmatists at some point. Third is pragmatism of philosophy. So yes, otherwise we wouldn't be studying it, is the easy answer. But it is a philosophy. It is a way of examining the world. It is a way of understanding our educational environment in particular. But the question there comes from the idea that pragmatism has found its way into education. I think it's had a huge influence, in education, as the book says as well, particularly through Dewey, but in other ways as well. But I think that as the book presents it, it's found its way in through the back door. So pragmatists often, and there are reasons again that we'll get into, pragmatists often have not been, or were not, maybe as explicit about their views being influenced by pragmatic philosophy. But you can see really clearly the tenets of pragmatic philosophy in current American K-12, especially I would say K-12, but also higher ed, and we'll get into the higher ed portion there. But because it's so practically based, I think often there's confusion or question or doubt around whether or not it's a philosophy. I think this is one of the things that we're going to kick back and forth quite a bit on Thursday, and I want to hear some of your all's thoughts on. But I would suggest, and Osmond suggests, that this is in fact a philosophy. Next, messiest issue. If the end is the concern, what do pragmatists think of the idea of lifelong learning? So this is lifelong learning I'm taking from our discussion last week about East Asian philosophies. So if the end is to become educated in some subject or some philosophy, then should your education end when that is achieved? Pragmatists, I think it would be easy to paint pragmatist in that way. I think that would be wrong. I think the chapter bears this out, and I would suggest, based on my experience, that that is not correct. The end doesn't mean that something is over. The end is simply the achievement of your desired result in this context, right? So let me say that again. The end does not mean that something is over in this context, only that you have achieved or reached your desired result to some degree or another. So receiving an education does not mean that your education is over or reaching some milestone in your education. So when this class is over, I hope that none of you would believe that your education is over, right? Or certainly not your education in the philosophy of higher education. That's not over. So lifelong learning absolutely is a part of a pragmatic philosophy. And actually, it heavily influences it if you look at the way that pragmatists view the ongoing, or the role of an ongoing, ever-changing society. Okay, so finally, the role of social evolution of pragmatism. I've touched on this a few times, but we'll want to talk about this a little more on Thursday. But it is a key tenet in pragmatism that changes in society and an environment should influence what is happening in the system of education. And so that often criticisms are levied against pragmatists because often it's said, well, you can't just change all the time. You have to have some fundamentals. You have to have some stakes in the ground. And so there's some debate there to be had, and I think we can get into some of that on Thursday. But I just wanted to highlight there, it wasn't really a question or an answer, but I just want to highlight the important role of social evolution and ongoing environmental evolution in terms of pragmatism. Okay, so that's the chapter. The article was, again, I think a little bit more straightforward. So I'm just going to give you the big summary on this. We can get into some messier issues, but we're going to use the article as our jumping off point for our case study this week. So I'm not going to really present any messy issues. We'll have a lot more conversation about this. But here is the big summary that I would provide for you for the article. First, There's a lot of pressure for higher education to define what it is, or what it does, excuse me, and why. And reformers are anxious to offer alternative models. That's the way that the article starts. And we've talked quite a bit about that in our class. The conversations around higher ed reform are difficult because, in part at least, there's no common definition of what higher education is or what it's supposed to be. And these conversations tend to happen with people using one of three primary languages. We'll get into this again: utilitarianism, pragmatism, or virtue ethics. Utilitarianism is concerned with the happiness of the customer. In this context, students. People from this point of view don't see a standing purpose for higher education to achieve other than helping students be happy and achieve whatever they want to achieve. So if you all, for example, wanted me to stand and lecture every week, then from this point of view, that's what I should do. Next, pragmatists aren't concerned with what is true, but what works. I've talked about that quite a bit in this. Truth will change, and your beliefs should as well. The pragmatist concerns himself with today's world and how higher education can serve it, but not with the past. So, again, some of the things that I just discussed relative to the chapter are present there. And finally, virtue ethics suggests that means and ends should not be disconnected. A university's end is clear, to aid in the acquisition of knowledge, and the means toward that end are relatively constant. So basically, faculty tend toward this view because it holds that there's a core which must be maintained for any end to be achieved. That tiny soul that we talked about in week 2, right? Or week 3, excuse me. So that's the big summary for the article. Gave you the summary for the chapter as well and presented a few messy issues. We're going to get a lot more into it on Thursday. I'm going to present to you a case study. The case study is going to be around the introduction of performance-based funding here in Kentucky. I've got a couple handouts for you to look at, and then I'll do a short little. It's an article that has, I think, 3 or 4 video clips in it that are very, very short that we'll look at, that will help us address some of these issues. It's a reform-based conversation, so we'll talk about the pragmatic lens, and then we'll also talk about how some of these languages may or may not be in use. Okay, so that's what we're going to be getting into on Thursday. I'm looking forward to it. As always, you all can just always feel free to reach out to me, and I'll see you a couple nights. Thanks.